I think you can. Would you mind, can you help me out? Stick on the back of my dress. Sorry, I should probably done this before that we started.
Okay.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning and good evening for people online. I know today there are people from...
Microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes, no. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening for people who are joining us online. I know there are people from South Africa, India, Greece, a few other countries, even someone saying that he's joining from the future. So I don't exactly know what it means. So this is the third session of our strategic debate for this year on our new topic, which is looking beyond the obvious. And tonight, this afternoon, we have the pleasure to be with Lucy Crehan, whom we know well at IEP. She has worked with us, and especially with Barbara, I think, who is here, and Chloe. So thank you for joining us. Lucy will talk about a new book, Clever Lens, and it promises to be very interesting. Sonia Guerrero, who is from UNESCO, is going to be the discussant. So you will have time to ask questions at the end of the presentations. And for people joining online, you can put comments on YouTube and also send questions, comments, feedback, not too long if you can, on #strategic-debate. So there we are. Michaela, I'd like to introduce our participants tonight. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Hugo, for this warm welcome in the name of IEP Leadership. I'm the moderator of this debate, and I think we have a very interesting topic this afternoon: classroom realities of the world's education superpowers. That's very promising. And I think we have chosen the topic because on the one hand, we have a recognition that there is a global learning crisis, and we have quite a bit of evidence on that. For instance, the 2012 OECD PISA results demonstrate that in some countries, students near the compulsory education do not acquire the basic level of knowledge and skills that are essential to participate in modern societies. So we have, on the one hand, an acknowledgement, recognition of a learning problem, but on the other hand, we have also evidence that some countries are performing very well. And also, they're not performing only very well at the top level, they're performing also very well at the lower level. So they have a good overall performance in terms of learning outcomes. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes it that some countries are performing so well? How are classroom environments in these systems organized? When are students sorted by competency levels? And what kind of lessons can we draw from the experience of these countries? So today's strategic debate will help us to answer some of these questions, or will provide us with elements on some of these questions. And in pursuit of a strategic development goal number 4, we will discuss how we can draw on evidence of some of the world's top performing systems for achieving inclusive and high quality education for all. Let me also say some words about our speakers. So Lucy Crehan with us. She's the author of the book Clever Lens. Some of you, you will have seen the cover page on the announcement for our strategic debate. Lucy herself is a teacher. She used to work as a teacher, as a science teacher. And during her time as a teacher, she witnessed a range of rapid policy changes in her country, which claimed to be inspired by the lessons learned from the world's top performing systems. And she wanted to know more about this. And so she went out of the country and visited and taught a few weeks, I think, in these systems, in these high-performing systems, and really to see how things work at the classroom reality. Yeah? So we are really very eager today to hear some of her lessons. And we have also Sonia with us, Sonia Guerriero. She is a colleague from UNESCO, senior education specialist. She's working at the section for teacher development at UNESCO. She will act as the discussant. And Sonia has extensive experience and knowledge in the field of education, otherwise she wouldn't be here. And in particular, an area of work related to teacher policies and assessment of student outcomes. And before joining UNESCO, she worked for the OECD, managing PISA. So I think that's what I read, at least. Maybe you will explain. International Student Assessment and the International Teacher Knowledge Survey. So Sonia obtained a doctorate degree in experimental psychology from Gill University in Canada. So I think we have two very experienced educationists, and we are looking forward to your presentation. So Lucy, for you to start, and then Sonia will follow up with her comments that will lead into the discussion with the audience.
Thank you very much. Now, can I just check that this is turned on? Can you hear me okay? Is this on? Yes? Lovely. Okay. Oh, sorry. How does this work? Right, I'll just begin while we have turn on the screen. Thank you so much for your help with that. I will be standing up because once a teacher, always a teacher. I find it very difficult to speak while sitting down. So that's why I'll be speaking standing up today. So I did begin my career in teaching. I taught in a school in Southwest London. I taught science and psychology. And during that time, I was there for 3 years. It was a challenging job. Teaching is challenging in most places. Thank you so much. Particularly in your first few years. And I expected that. I fully anticipated that I would find it difficult. What I didn't anticipate was that some of those challenges would come from the policy level. Some of the most difficult things about my job were as a result of government policy or how that policy was interpreted by the management of my school. So that led me to become being waved at. Is it not on? It's not on. Let's just turn it on. If I have to sit down, I'll sit down. Hello? Testing, testing. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. Sorry about that. Sorry to everyone online as well. So I became interested in education policy and wanted to study that at a master's level. This was at the time when the Secretary of State for Education in England did talk a lot about international comparisons. And many of the changes that were being made were justified with recourse to these international comparisons. We're going to do this because that's what Finland does. We're going to do this because this is what Singapore does. And the rate of change was rapid, and I didn't feel as a teacher that it was always that helpful. So I thought I'd like to go and have a look and see what these countries were really doing. So I began by looking at the data and studied some of the OECD reports on this, which are extremely helpful. But I suppose as a teacher myself, what I really missed was a sense of what that looks like in the classroom and an understanding of how various different policies fit together. Because of course, you can look for a correlation between a particular policy and PISA results, but no one policy works in isolation. They interrelate to each other and they work in a particular cultural context as well. So at the time I finished my master's degree, I was a bit younger and I had no adult responsibilities like a mortgage or a husband to keep me in the country. So I decided to go and have a look at what these countries were doing. So I emailed teachers got in touch via social media, and I said, I'm Lucy, I'm a teacher from England. I'd love to learn about what you're doing. Can I help out? You know, I can come and teach for free. I can help out in the classroom any way you like. And can I stay with you too, please? And remarkably, you know, educators all around the world are wonderfully generous people. And they said yes. So what I actually did, approached teachers under the radar, as I said, just through emailing them, asking them directly. What I didn't do was go through NGOs or government and say, please, can you put me in touch with some schools? Because I have since found that when you do that, you get directed to a particular type of school and particular classrooms. You get the most innovative schools who are considered to be the best teachers, and you don't get a sense of the spread of practice across the country in the way that if you go to what's considered to be an average school and go to a few of those, then you do. I took an ethnographic case study approach. So as I said, I went to 5 different countries. I spent a month in each place living with teachers. So I was in the classroom, I was in the staff room, chatting to teachers. Some interviews were formal and recorded. Others were informal chats over a bowl of noodles or in the car on the way to school. I spent 3 to 4 weeks in each country, and I should say those countries are Finland, 2 provinces in Canada, Japan, Singapore, and Shanghai, China. 2 to 3 weeks of those at least inside schools, and always at least 1 to 2 weeks in just one school, because it takes a little while for teachers or any human beings to relax in your company and realize that I'm not spying on them or trying to catch them out, that actually I'm another teacher that wants to learn from what they're doing. So that way teachers got to know me, relaxed in my company, and we could just have a good chat about what they perceive to be the reasons for the success of the system and also some of the challenges. Interviewed everyone. And then I came home and identified themes and commonalities from my observations, my conversations, and also had to look at wider data sets, because of course, just looking at 3 or 4 schools in a country isn't enough. I can't make generalizations, particularly about pedagogy, based on just my own observations. So I triangulated that with PISA data, TALIS data, as well as what other researchers have found in their own more qualitative studies. And what I'm going to do today, because we're looking beyond the obvious, is focus on 3 surprising findings. Perhaps they're surprising, perhaps you won't find them surprising, but they are based on pedagogy, professionalism, and the underlying philosophy that I found in these different systems. So let's begin with pedagogy, which fundamentally is one of the most important things. Now I'm going to dive straight into OECD data, rather than telling you more about my own experiences initially. What's really helpful is that in PISA 2009 and PISA 2012, 2012 and 2015, the OECD also asked teachers and students questions in addition to the tests that students take. And specifically, the students were asked questions about the kind of pedagogy they experienced. So what their teachers commonly did in their lessons. And they were asked a number of different factors, and some of them are laid out here. And they were asked whether they agree or strongly agree that their teacher does these things. So the teacher in their last, this is maths lesson. So this is from PISA 2012. So what the OECD then did is they've taken these statements and they've divided them into, actually they divided into 4 indices, but I'm just going to talk about 2 right now, that describe different ways that teachers can teach. And here we have student-oriented instruction and teacher-directed instruction. That's my mistake. I'll just give you a second to have a read of those. Actually, I'll read them through just in case for those watching online. So student-oriented instruction, the teacher gives different work to classmates who have difficulties learning or who can advance faster. The teacher assigns projects that require at least 1 week to complete. The teacher has us work in small groups to come up with joint solutions to a problem or task. And the teacher asks us to help plan classroom topics or activities. Teacher-directed instruction is taken to be a combination of these different factors. The teacher sets clear goals for our learning. The teacher asks me or my classmates to present our thinking or reasoning at some length. The teacher asks questions to check whether we've understood what we've been taught. At the beginning of the lesson, the teacher presents a short summary of the previous lesson, and the teacher tells us what we have to learn. So no doubt, as I imagine that most of you, if not all of you work in education, you would have come across these two very, very broadly different approaches to teaching, although of course there's so much nuance within both of these, and people, when they use words student-oriented and teacher-directed, will often mean different things. But for now, we'll just take how they've been defined here by the OECD. I would like to get a bit of audience participation. So I'd like you just for 30 seconds to have a think and talk to your neighbour about the kind of teaching that you think students would be reporting more of in Singapore and in Finland. And I'm going to ask you to put a number on it in a minute, but just have a think about the kind of teaching you might expect in those two countries based on what you've read about them. Okay, thank you. I'm now going to ask you to put a number on it. So this is a graph which I've partly covered, so I can do a big reveal. This is from the OECD. It's a working paper produced in 2016, and this is based on the same data. So this is still maths 2012. Yes. So along the bottom here, you've got the ratio of those two different indices. So essentially down that end, you've got students who are reporting what they call less traditional, so more student-oriented instruction. Over this side, you've got students who are reporting that they receive more traditional or teacher-directed instruction. What the numbers correspond to is the ratio. So what this already gives away is that most countries, students are reporting that they get more teacher-directed instruction than student-oriented. Because this number 1 over here means they're reporting about the same amount of each. 2 means they're reporting twice as much teacher-directed as student-oriented, etc. So up here, if a country is on here, it means that they're reporting 5 times as much teacher-directed instruction as student-oriented instruction. Okay? Now, you've just had a little chat about Finland and Singapore. Can I ask you to pick a number for each one? Where on the graph do you think these different countries will fall? Will they be further down the student-oriented side or further up the teacher-directed side? So if you attended my talk at the OECD, Ava and Chloe, you're not allowed to play. Okay, have a minute to talk about that. Pick a number. Okay, now I'm going to ask everyone to commit to something. I want to see everyone's hand up at least once. What I'm going to do, we're going to start with Finland. I'm going to walk across the graph, okay? And I want you to put your hand up when I pass the number where you think Finland will be. So just a reminder, this is student-oriented. The most student-oriented, that's the most teacher-directed. Are you ready? Yes. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Interesting, thank you. Let's do the same thing with Singapore. Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. That's really interesting. So Singapore seems to be completely spread out in terms of its perceptions. Finland seems to be, most people will put in their hand up between 1 and 2 here. Okay, should we have a look at what the answers are? Well, this is what students say. Of course, this is student report. So I can't say that this is definitely what is happening across the country, but this is students' perceptions of what's happening. So the red dots are top performers. Singapore's here, Finland is here. They're in exactly the same place. Exactly the same place. And not only is it those two, but the other red dots are other top performers in mathematics that year. You've got Netherlands, Canada, Singapore, Japan, Finland, Macau, Chinese Taipei, Vietnam, and Korea, all in basically the same place on this. Now, coming to my experience in terms of what I've seen in these classrooms, that doesn't surprise me. Certainly it surprised me when I first went there, having read the newspaper articles about what they're doing in Finland, to then see what they're doing in Finland was quite a surprise. I'm going to read you a quote from a Finnish student called Emma. Emma was 16 at the time that I met her. And I said, Emma, what's a typical lesson like in Finland? You know, I know it's a silly question, but just tell me what happens in a normal lesson. And Emma said, we'd come into class and be seated and go through the homework. If you hadn't done it, there'd be such anxiety because they'd call out random people for the answers, and if they picked you, you wouldn't know. Then they'd see if anyone had anything to say about it or anything to ask. Then we'd go through the next subject we were going to talk about, like this is how it works and that's how it goes. And we'd make notes and ask questions and discuss. Then they'd give us some exercises to do from our workbooks, and that would be the rest of the lesson. The teacher would go to individual people if they had questions, but it depends on the subject. It was like that in maths, but in languages, we'd have sets of work, like oral work and pair games. So that's an example from Finland. And in terms of just the ratio here, it's not that obviously that it's entirely teacher-directed, but it's about 3 times as much. So in terms of what you'd see in the more student-oriented type practices, you certainly would see group work in Japan, in Singapore, but it would be quite structured. It would be, right, 5 minutes on this particular question. I want you to solve this, as opposed to having a week to pursue a project that they then go off and do by themselves. So definitely that's incorporated within it, but it's not something that you see a lot of the time. Of course, they do that sometimes, like it might be at the end of the module, but it's not happening a lot of the time. Now, you might think that isn't a surprise, perhaps, and that maybe the whole point of more student-oriented instruction is that it's not about the maths. It's not about children being able to apply the maths, which is what PISA measures, but actually it's more about communication and problem solving, for example. And actually the OECD have also looked at this, at creative problem solving in 2012 and collaborative problem solving in 2015. So I've added the countries that do well in creative problem solving on this graph. They're the blue ones. So you see they're almost the same as the ones that do well in general. And again, this pattern is that they tend to fall within this quite fairly narrow range. The countries that do well in both application of mathematical knowledge and also creative problem solving are doing roughly 3 to 3.5 times as much teacher-directed instruction as student-oriented instruction. But I want to move beyond that because in a way it's a bit of a false dichotomy, because obviously within teacher-directed instruction, within teacher having a clear aim and goals and checking understanding, there is a huge range of practice, and it's the same within student-oriented instruction. I want to pick out one other indices which I think actually explains a lot more of the success than this does, and that is called cognitive activation. So I'll just show you how that was. Oh, one other thing to add before I show you how that's defined. This is just taking the 2015 data, which is based on science, and this is analysis from McKinsey. So McKinsey had a look to see what they saw as in their analysis as being the factors that most affected high performance, and they also looked at these different indices of teaching as reported by students. In 2015, that was described as teacher-directed and inquiry-based. And once again, you'll see that this ideal balance appears to be, it's not one is good and one is bad, that there's a balance, but that balance is a bit more teacher-directed instruction and a bit less of the inquiry-based, but some. So they're saying the sweet spot combines teacher-directed instruction in most to all classes with inquiry-based learning in some. So it's not that there is a good way of teaching and a bad way of teaching in terms of these indices. It's about the balance of the two and how they're used. Just briefly coming on to the science, sorry, this is the science, onto the cognitive activation. These, I won't read all of these out, but this is the index of cognitive activation. This is going back to mathematics. And it's things like the teacher asks questions that make us reflect on the problem. The teacher gives problems that require us to think for an extended period of time, or gives problems that can be solved in several different ways. So really, it's about getting students thinking and giving them the opportunities to solve things in their own way. And if I can take the liberty, this is about mathematics, but if I can take the liberty to apply this kind of teaching to other subjects, it will be about asking the student a question that allows them to give their own answer rather than there just being one correct answer. Getting children to write a story rather than just do comprehension questions on an existing story. It's bringing in the students' agency to actually produce their own answers. That's not the same thing as giving the students complete free choice over what activity they do, but rather, once you've given them the activity, how they then go about answering it. And the reason I put this index up is because this had remarkable results in terms of correlations with PISA's success. So I think I've got this up here. No, I'm just going to tell you about it. So in every single country that took part in PISA, there was a positive correlation between teachers or students reporting, teachers using this kind of instruction, and student results. It was helpful at every single level of difficulty in terms of PISA, the easiest questions and the hardest questions. In contrast, the student-oriented instructional indices had a negative relationship with PISA results in every single country except Albania. So there's quite a stark difference there in terms of the students, how much they're reporting these things are being used with instructional educational success. And let me give you an example of this, because this is something that I saw time and time again in the classrooms that I was in. Let's take a classroom in Singapore, for example, or Japan, where they might start with getting students to solve a problem, come up with some real life situation where you need to use maths in order to solve that, get the students to try it initially. That gets the students interested. Then there might be a little bit of more formal teaching with the teacher modeling how to do a certain thing on the board. Then there might be group work where the students are trying out a different example of that kind of problem. But crucially, what's really interesting here is the way that the teacher is using the questioning, because she might ask, okay, well, what do you think is a way to solve that? That's interesting. I'll write that up. I'm not going to say if it's right or wrong yet, but that's great. What did you think of her answer? Can you think of a different way that you might do it? Okay, so lots of interactive whole class discussion, really getting the students to think deeply and justify their answers and to build on each other's thinking. So that would be my kind of personal description of what I think is being picked up by this index here. So I'm going to move on. So pedagogy is obviously enormous, and I've just attempted to cover one surprise in just 10 minutes, but I'm going to move on, and maybe we can pick that up later. And tell you about hospitals. So I wasn't only inside classrooms on this trip, I was also inside hospitals. That was not intentional. I ended up in hospital twice on my trip. Once I had a rare Finnish disease called rabbit fever, where my lymph nodes swelled up and I was on a drip in a hospital in Finland for a week. And was treated with, amazing professionalism by the doctors, who just trusted them to give me all the right drugs and just lay there and watch Netflix. I was also in hospital in Singapore, where my legs swelled up, and I thought I might have deep vein thrombosis. When I went into hospital on this occasion, I was treated by quite a young doctor, a relatively new doctor, and he had to take blood in order to do this test. And he tried taking blood from here, 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 and here. And he wasn't quite able to do it, which wasn't very comfortable. And at which point, he called on the help of a senior colleague to come in and support him. And together, the senior colleague, they had a conversation about what was the best option. They ended up taking blood from my leg. But it was still the junior doctor who did it, but supervised. Now, I don't think it was an affront to the professionalism of that young doctor that he wasn't able to innovate in that situation. I'm quite pleased, actually, that when he wasn't able to take blood, he didn't think, Wonder where would be the best place to take blood from? Let me try her neck. I think actually it was an enhancement of the professionalism of that young doctor and what it says about medicine as a whole, that he had a more senior experienced colleague available who was able to come in and support him. And actually, but even that senior colleague wasn't only drawing on his own experience. Of course, he was drawing on his own experience, but he was also drawing on guidelines on what to do in case of female has come in dehydrated and you can't take the blood. You know, he's got research evidence on that and he's following that. Now, the reason that I'm putting this as a surprise is because sometimes I've had conversations within the educational context where it is assumed that to be a true profession, teachers should be able to do their own thing in their own classroom without having to follow any particular guidelines or having any particular knowledge, that it's their domain and it's their experience and they know what they're doing. And that's what it means to be professional. I'm contesting what it means to be a professional, and certainly in the case of medicine, and we always refer to doctors as being an example of a profession, they are not able to do that. They have autonomy, but they're also following guidelines and the help of their more senior colleagues. So let me explain what that looks like in these countries. So this is a contrast first of all. So I've just taken a couple of stats from the UK and the USA. This is a relatively small sample size, so apologies I haven't got it up there. But it's just a new app called Teacher Tap in the UK, which is really interesting, where teachers have an app and they just answer one question a day about their teaching practice. And they were asked, think about the last lesson you've just taught. How did you plan for that lesson? And 57% of teachers plan that entirely alone. And that's not based on an initial plan, because that's another option. It's just them planning themselves from scratch. Similarly, in the USA, a recent study conducted by the Brands Foundation found that of the 99% of teachers who drew upon materials that they've developed or selected themselves, which is no bad thing, where are they drawing them from? 96% from Google, 74.5% from Pinterest. So that's just to point out that the danger of expecting teachers to plan completely from scratch by themselves is that they won't necessarily be good lessons. Because if you think, if you're teaching 5 or 6 lessons a day, and I've been there, and you're planning from scratch, think how much time on your evening you have to spend designing each of those lessons. You're going to have 20 minutes, perhaps. You're not going to have the time to really think about, let's have a look at what we know already about this subject and what are students' misconceptions and what are the best questions to really get the best out of students. So let's go back to Singapore and a lesson I was watching on friction. And while the students were doing a little activity on friction with different materials on the desk, I walked over to the teacher's desk. And on the teacher's desk, open on a page about friction, was not a textbook, but a teacher's guide that laid out, here are suggested activities for this topic, questions you can ask the students to really get them thinking deeply, questions that you can ask to assess whether or not the students have understood, so you know whether or not to move on, and some sample assessment questions for the students to try and suggested homework. Now, that is not, teacher, you must do this, you must say what it does, do what it says in the book, but that is a huge help to a teacher delivering a lesson which is excellent, because they already have a lot of good resources there already. So what I'm suggesting, one approach to reducing workload and improving teaching is to shift responsibility for lesson design to more experienced teachers. Not completely, not so that teachers don't have a choice over what they teach. They have to make that plan their own. They have to adapt it for their particular students. But all teachers should have something to begin with to work with. And this is just an indication of textbook use, because I think that does link into the use of high quality textbooks. In England and I think in America, there is this idea that if you use a textbook, you're not a very good teacher. And if you were a good teacher, you'd be finding your own resources, your own videos from YouTube, there'd be a carousel, students would be going around the room doing card sorts. That is great every now and then if you've got the energy to plan it, but it means that teachers are feeling that they have to plan every lesson from scratch. Whereas if you look at what they're doing in Singapore and Finland, they're actually using, I mean, there are some pretty well-designed textbooks with expert teacher input, but they're using textbooks. And unfortunately, I haven't bookmarked the quotes, but But I asked one of the teachers I stayed with in Finland about textbooks, whether she used them. She said, well, of course, they're really good. They're well designed. They're motivating for the students. Sure, I think it's typical across Finland that teachers do this. Sure, some teachers decide not to use it and do their own thing, but who has the time? I've got lots of other stuff to do. So perhaps controversial, perhaps not. I don't know what you will find surprising. I'd love to hear about this in a moment. So an alternative to self-sufficiency, standing on the shoulders of giants, taking lessons. I mean, this is also done through things like lesson study in East Asia, taking lessons that have been designed by expert teachers or by a group of teachers together and using those as resources for all teachers. So finally, my third surprise is always something that really surprised me, coming from the context that I do, which is England. And this can be summed up by what Bart Simpson and Chinese teachers have in common. So, and it's linked to what I saw as being an underlying philosophy. In most of the countries I visited, less so Singapore at a secondary level, and I'll come on to that, but everywhere else. So there were a couple of occasions in Shanghai where I met teachers who'd done exchanges, who'd either taught in America for a little while or in England for a little while. And I said, of course I did. What were the differences? What did you think? What do you think of the strengths of the systems you were in compared to the Shanghai system? What do you think of the weaknesses? And they gave lots of the strengths, of which there are strengths. There are things that we do well in England. They felt a bit awkward about any criticism, but when gently pushed, both of them said something quite similar. This is two different conversations. And both of them said, the one thing I found a bit strange is that some students, they're given much easier work. How are they supposed to keep up with their peers if they're given easier work? And I did not have an answer for them. Because in truth, in England, when we give some students easier work, we don't expect them to keep up with their peers. We set in lower expectations. And I had never really fully comprehended that until these teachers made that point. And Bart Simpson says something similar. There's one episode in which he's put in a remedial class, and he says, now let me get this straight. We're behind the rest of our class, and we're going to catch up with them by going slower than they are. Cuckoo. So really, kind of those conversations with those Chinese teachers, and also as expressed by Bart, really actually was something quite fundamental in the differences between the systems that I visited and my own system, and I know a few others. We can sum this up in a policy sense as well. So in 4 of the 5 systems I visited, in Canada, the different provinces, in Finland, in Shanghai, and in Japan, students are not tracked into different schools until age 15 or 16. And it's not just a coincidence, because those are the ones I visited. If you look at the top 12 top performers in 2012, which is back when I was out there, 10 of them are not tracking students into different schools until later than the OECD average, again, till 15 or 16, the OECD average being 14. Incidentally, Finland, Canada, and Japan are 3 of the top performing systems that are also the most equitable. So if you want high performance and equity, and not only high performance, this seems to have something to do with it. And this is not just based on this observation, but there's also been research done by Weissman and Hanushek, some economists who've looked at this across countries that take part in PISA. But it was more than that. And I said 4 out of 5. It was Singapore does start selecting students at age 12, but they do have, well, we'll come back to Singapore. Let's look within schools, because it's not only that you're putting students, you're waiting to separate students until a bit later. It's the same is happening within schools. So in those 4 systems, they're not putting them into different classes based on ability either. They're in mixed attainment groups, again, right up to 15 or 16. Now from England, that was quite a surprise, because in England, we put them into different groups based on their ability, because our idea is we'll be able to teach them better that way. That we'll be able to teach the brighter students better, and we'll be able to teach the the less able students better. But actually, if you look at the research on this, and this is a summary from the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, it has a negative impact overall. If you set children into different classes based on ability, overall, it has a negative impact. It's very low cost, but it still has a negative impact. So what are they doing instead? Because that's really difficult. You know, any of you who have been teachers will know that teaching a class with mixed attainment is hard. And that is the fundamental idea that all students will achieve here. You know, they'll have a national or a provincial curriculum. This will be the expectation for children in year 8. That's the basis. And then they align all of their policies and practices around making that happen. So instead of having lower expectations for some students, they give extra support to those students. So rather than saying, as we do, unfortunately, in England, you've come into secondary school at this level, so you can achieve here by the end of it. And you've come into secondary school at this level, so you can achieve here. And well done, you've still made progress, but you're not going to achieve the same high standard as your peers. That's not what they're doing. They're saying everyone's going to achieve here. We'll identify early on, in primary school, in early years, if children are falling behind, and we'll give them extra intervention and extra support to make sure they keep up. And if that still sounds difficult, it is. There are a few things that they do to make this possible. How on earth do they make it work? Firstly, you've got, it's planning. So if you've got well-trained teachers planning together, as they do in a lesson study, and sorry, I haven't had time to talk much about that, then they're ensuring that each concept is taught really clearly the first time in a few different ways. So first of all, it's just the initial teaching of a topic will be very clear. So hopefully most of your students therefore will get it just the first time. The curriculum, particularly in Shanghai and Singapore and Japan, is designed for mastery. What I mean by that is that there's less content in the curriculum in the first few years of school, so that they can make sure that all of the students are getting those fundamentals, and the whole class moves on at the same pace. So they won't move on to the next topic until all the students have got the fundamentals of number and whatever it is. And there's an element of that in the Finnish system as well, in that they're not starting formal schooling till age 7. But they have high quality preschool. So by the time they're beginning, most students will have the prerequisite skills required to access the curriculum at that stage. And then finally, they do either employ or make time for additional teacher support for those students who need it. So in Finland and Canada, that means extra teachers who will work with students during them out of class or in class, qualified teachers as opposed to teaching assistants. In Japan, Shanghai and Singapore, the teachers actually are teaching fewer lessons because they have bigger classes, but then they have more time to support students outside of class. So in the breaks in between lessons, in study sessions in the afternoon or even after school. And it wouldn't be fair to not mention that some parents pay for private tuition if the students are still falling behind. So there's, I think, probably quite a lot there. I'll stop now, but love to discuss any or all of this with you all later. That's me. If anyone wants to contact me later on, all my details are there. Thank you very much. Okay, should I have to sit over here now?
So Lucy, perfect lesson planning. You have been perfectly on time, 45 minutes. That's wonderful. May I then call on Sonia to present the discussants' comments?
Is it me?
It's fine.
Okay. So, thank you. Oh. Can I stand up too?
Yes,
I think
but
it's
stay
easy.
relatively, can keep them.
Yeah. Can I remove it?
Just stay like that.
Oh.
And don't move too much.
Oh. Okay, I will go this way then. That's okay. That's okay. Can you hear me if I stand this far away from the microphone? It's okay? No, it's not okay.
A little bit closer.
Sorry, no. We'll manage, don't worry.
Speak. You just speak into that. Then you can walk around with it.
Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Okay. Sorry, now I need my notes. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you very much for inviting me to this debate. It was a pleasure to read Lucy's book. I have made, I've given some reactions and also some comments for discussion later on, which is what I think is the purpose of this debate. So I will start with some comments that came to me as I was reading this book. And when I was first asked to read the book, I thought, well, not another book about somebody talking about their experiences, talking to teachers and just describing the one case. It's the same story over and over again. And so I was happily surprised you talked about your experiences in the book, but what I really came away with that I really appreciate is that you backed everything up with evidence, which I think is really important. And you've said that in your presentation today, and you've talked about how it looked like in reality in the classroom, but then you went through lots and lots and lots of research to explain how this is working, not because I'm looking at it, but because it's actually been studied. So for example, the early learning, the early play that they're doing in Finland, where there are studies backing up how early learning through play is actually really beneficial to children, early numeracy and literacy activities through play, but how in the early ages, it's also really key to developing children's social emotional skills. And that's really important. I'm glad, and that's just one example. There is evidence throughout. I also appreciated that in understanding a system, it's important to put it in its historical context. And you spent time on that as well. So it helps the reader in this book compared to other books. It helps the reader understand why the situation is the way it is, or what motivated an educational reform, or what could be explaining certain things if you understand the history of the country. So I really appreciated you adding that in your book, as well as the social and cultural context underpinning the performance. And here I'm thinking back of how you explain how in Finland and in Japan, in Finland, it was about us forming the identity of the Finnish people. They wanted to have an education system to set them apart. And in Japan, the idea of how it was something about the children, their characters are shaped, and how in the early years the children are in what's called a han, and it seems like they might be running wild, but it's actually a part of shaping their character, which is really important for the it's valued in the Japanese context, because this is what they value. They value people who are able to fit within the system, and this is also how it explains how Japanese teenagers can put up with such difficult, stressful testing situations, because they have such high expectations from their parents, but also from society. And again, backed up by evidence, higher expectations leads children to perform better. You talked a lot about pedagogy and how children learn, which I also really appreciate, because and you didn't just say one method is better than another. You went into the details like you just did before. You talked about how teacher-directed instruction, why teacher-directed instruction is more efficient than just student-oriented instruction, but that it's a combination of the two. And the reason why it's a combination of the two is largely due to the teacher who is able. You give the example of Quebec, where it's because the teachers have have a deep understanding. In the example, it was of math didactics or pedagogical content knowledge. So I also appreciated learning about that. And of course, you brought up teachers and the teaching profession, which it is true that students cannot succeed without their teachers. And you argued that the teaching is a profession, and teachers should be trained to a sufficient degree, a period of training where there is certification, where there is induction and mentoring. All of these key concepts are important based on what I've learned about the teaching profession, and you've made sure to bring this up. So I have a very good, I really like the book. I have a very good review of the book. So I thought, since my work is on teachers, I thought one of the things that we could think about for this debate is about teaching, since, as we know, teaching, a student characteristic society, teachers are one of the key factors that lead to higher student achievement. So we know we need a high quality teacher, but since we're in the UNESCO context, we know that we're all working towards the SDG 4s, and how we know we have a shortage of teachers. Since 2016, it was estimated we have a shortage of 69 million teachers to have universal education by 2030. So we all need to be working towards how are we going to recruit all these teachers, right? So I thought what I would do is bring about some of the challenges that are facing us as a global society in having to recruit 69 million teachers by 2030 to have universal education, primary and secondary, for all children. So I wanted to bring in some other data from the developing context. And this is data from the SACMEX study, which is in Africa, and I've listed the countries across the top. One of the things you mentioned is how the teachers in Finland have access to textbooks, high quality textbooks, and they come with teacher guides. And they explain how the teacher, it's not about dictating what the teachers should say, but it gives suggestions for the lessons, and it gives suggestions for the assignments. And this is what is supporting the high quality education in Finland, because the teachers are standing on the shoulders of giants. They can focus more on teaching and not preparation. This shows the first two, teacher guide reading, teacher guide math. These are students in those countries that are reporting 82% for reading and 78% for math. Students reporting that they are in classes where the teacher has a guide. So not every teacher has access to a guide that can support them. I've marked the change since 2000. This is an improvement, which is a plus. So that's 2000 to 2007. I also want to point out these two here. Children also themselves need to have access to a high quality textbook. But in these countries, and this is an average, only 42% and 41% of children have access to their own math or reading textbook. So the teacher doesn't have a teacher guide, the student doesn't have a textbook. So this has an impact on their learning. Here's another example from the PASEC study in 2014, looking at textbooks again, and this shows you how textbooks are distributed among the students in these classes. So in some cases, for example, Chad, Niger, we have a large chunk of the kids where they have one textbook for 3 kids having to share. And that's in reading. In math, Burundi, Cameroon, Chad, again, high chunks, high proportions of kids having to share one textbook. That's 3 or more. Some instances, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, a little bit better, one textbook per pupil. So the point I'm trying to make is how this is a challenge for the students, a challenge for the teachers when textbooks are an issue. You also mentioned, you spoke in your book about didactics and teacher pedagogical knowledge, and how the teachers who have a higher degree of pedagogical knowledge have students with better scores because they're more able to, deconstruct the content, teach, understand students' misconceptions, really get the students to learn the material through questioning and tough examples and things like that. In the SACMEC countries in 2007, 58% and 46% of the students had a teacher with sufficient math or reading knowledge. So that's one of the challenges that we are faced with globally for learning. To give you a different perspective on this, in the PASEC study, they've also looked at teachers' qualifications and training for grade 6, and looking at teachers' highest academic level. In some countries, so for instance, Togo, Niger, you'll notice it's the same countries that repeat, Cameroon, Congo. This color is this color. Teachers' highest level of education is a secondary level. So even when it comes to teachers' initial teacher training, there's still lots of gaps that need to be met. So for example, again in Cameroon, sorry, the colors don't show out so great. Niger, Togo, teachers have less than 6 months of training before they're in the classroom. I'm having trouble seeing my colors as well. In Niger, that's at least 1 year. So there's a lot of work to be done. So teacher training is that you brought up in your book is an issue for the developing world. The other thing you talked about was about teacher motivation and how teacher motivation is really important. It's very linked to student motivation and student achievement, and how teachers who have autonomy and who are well trained and feel self-efficacy are more motivated, and more motivated teachers are likely to stay in the profession and not leave the profession, which is really important in having a qualified teaching profession. And in the developing world, we hear lots of statistics about how there's a high rate of teacher absenteeism, from 20% to 40%. It ranges. The data are not clear or consistent. And this was looked into in some detail. This was in the GEMAR report that just recently came out. And this is a colleague of mine, Fatun Yang, this was her PhD thesis. And what she looked at was, what is behind those teacher absences? Are teachers just not showing up? And just, they're on the payroll, but they're not in the classrooms. And actually, of the data once it's decomposed, only 11.6 of the days. So in total, the students lose over 50 days of the school year, of the allotted days of learning. Of those days, 50 are lost. That's a lot. But of those, there's only 11 that are due to actual teacher absences, which is okay. We all get about 12 sick days a year, I think. So that's kind of what we get here. Interestingly, the biggest chunk of days lost were due to system issues, like a school that was closed because it was under repair, or because there was a flood, or because sometimes a school was closed because there were just no resources in the school. The school needed to be cleaned for whatever reason. So in terms of teacher motivation, I think what's really key is understanding motivation, how it applies to different contexts, because sometimes teachers are blamed for something when it's really not entirely their fault, and it's a system issue more than it is a teacher issue. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, there was 10.7 days lost to strikes, which is a big deal, because you don't want teachers to strike. But teachers are striking they're asking for better working conditions, and sometimes their working conditions are poor. And this is why we all have the right to strike in our democratic societies if we want our working conditions to improve. And again, this is another study by my colleague Fatou and her colleagues that was trying to understand the situation, teachers' employment conditions in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And these were 24 countries. And it turns out in the developing context, teachers are under temporary contracts. They don't have a stable contract. So often the data are not comparable. It's hard to find good data, but often what happens with these contract teachers, they tend to be younger, less experienced. They don't have sufficient training, or they've not been trained. They have limited access to in-service training. And they're the ones stuck working in the more challenging environments, in the remote areas with marginalized populations. So these populations now are kind of suffering twice over because they're not getting a qualified teacher. And even there are lots of issues with contract teachers in private schools, where teachers are abused or exploited because they're under contract. So just a couple of the issues that I thought would be food for discussion for us when we look at how to learn from the high-performing systems, but what the challenges are for the current for world globally that we all have to tackle to improve the situation for teachers. So you mentioned, lastly, 5 key lessons, which I completely agree with you. Your key lessons out of the book were about how the top performing countries focus on early learning and school readiness through play, backed up by evidence. Teachers teach for mastery. It's not the case where, it's one-time lesson, move on to the next one. All students have to learn the concepts before they move on to the next one. It's expected. High expectations, high learning standards for all children. Everybody has to meet the same high expectations. You talked about well-trained, qualified, motivated teachers. Very important. And how school accountability was linked to school support. It's not, school accountability is not about sanctions or closing schools, but it was in the systems you covered. School accountability was a way to support those schools that were needing help. And the idea was, rather than say, if you don't improve, in a year we're closing the school, the idea was, oh, here's where you're needing some support. Let's help you improve so we can get there. And so that's really the way things should work. And I thought I would add 2 more to your 5 lessons that I thought of that I didn't see. This one you've mentioned, and you mentioned today, I wrote no copy pasting. It's not the case that we can take what happens in one system and just stick it into another system and it's gonna work. Every context is different. So we have to remember that we can learn these lessons from one system, but really have to understand the context of another system before we can adapt some lessons. I think everyone knows that. And the last one I wanted to bring in was that, and this is very important, we need data. And you've cited the research to support why those systems are performing. And I think a message here for the global context, where a lot of countries still don't have data systems in place where they can collect good quality comparable data, is that we need that data so we can make policies that are based on evidence. Mm-hmm. That's it. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you to both of you for excellent presentations. I think quite complementary perspectives also. Lucy, you focus more on the high-performing systems and the lessons that you have learned from your own research, and I think from your experiences in the classrooms. And Sonia, you provide a little bit more of evidence on what we know about some of the constraining factors actually in the developing countries. And I think that's very important that we again look at what type of systems are we talking about and what are the lessons that pertain really to what system. But I thought it was interesting that Lucy, you started off your presentation saying, I was a teacher in a classroom and there were all these policies coming down on us. So I decided to investigate more and try to find out what is really working well and what is not working so well. And you came up with quite a number of interesting policy lessons, which are quite transferable. And I think some of the quite practical lessons also, for instance, providing support to teachers and providing them with good quality material so that they can really focus on the teaching side. And I think that is something that pertains to all types of systems, whatever context we are working in now. So I think there are quite some interesting, very practical lessons I think that you have come up with. I want to open the floor now for the debate. I suggest that each of the speakers should present himself, herself, and I will pass around the microphone. And we take a number of questions, perhaps some 3 questions in a row, if this is agreeable to you. Yeah. So you can ask questions to both Lucy and, of course, Sonia on their respective presentations or in general. Perhaps also comments. I'm sure we have a lot of educators here in the room. So you have all something to say about some of the policy lessons. Myoko Saito from IEP, who has worked extensively on SACMEC for many, many years. Thank you, Myoko, to start shooting. Yes?
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation and also excellent comments from UNESCO, which put everything in perspective. We are not only looking at the top performing countries. I'm from Japan, by the way.
Top performing.
It was not the top performers. What Lucy did is an excellent example of using the data, triangulation of the quantitative, very technical data from PISA, and then also try to see what is behind and why certain things are working in certain countries. And but then after all, you are a researcher, right? So, coming back to what Sonia also mentioned, that we have to have the evidence in order to good policy making, etc. And then, so what would be, this is a question for both of you, in those challenging countries, SACMEC and PASIC and other maybe Asian countries that are not performing as well as Singapore, etc. For those who are in the Ministry of Education, for example, I'm not talking about those researchers at university level or the university professors and those people who always go to CIES to do the presentation. I'm not talking about those people. What about, what kind of things that you would propose in order for those planners, the people who are working in the Ministry of Education to do, and what kind of things, and how should they use the data?
Okay.
Big question.
Yeah. So what suggestions for the planners and how to use the data? Do you have any other questions for the time being? Everybody's reflecting. Okay, great. Can you present yourself?
Yes, of course. I'm from Denmark, the Danish delegation. I'm actually a student still. So I was just wondering about, based on the first debate we had about social and emotional skills, and based on your experience, how do you see they act or interact in regards to delivering effective teaching and obtaining good results?
Mm-hmm.
And a good presentation, by the way.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So what about the other skills that are often not measured via PISA and the like? Huh? Actually, you conclude your book with that. Huh? I just read it before I met you. Any other question?
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
I'm Pablo Martin.
Yes.
I'm an intern here at the IEP, and I've been also a teacher for several years in different levels. And that's kind of the question I wanted to ask you. In what level did you get into? I mean, you said you were a science teacher, so I'm guessing you work with teenagers.
Yeah.
But did you get to see how teaching was done in other levels, in primary education or pre-primary school? And and I really found it really interesting, the use of textbooks. Because when I was teaching, when I used it, because of my training, when I was using a textbook, I felt like I was doing something wrong. That it wasn't okay. The textbook that I had weren't that good, that's for sure. But I had this guilt feeling that I shouldn't be using, that I should be planning on my own at home, and I wasn't ready to spend 60 or 70 hours a week just to plan my lesson. So thanks for that. For that conclusion, it was really.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the presentation.
Okay, do you want to reply?
Sure.
Yes. First set of questions.
Or should I take this one? Okay. So I feel like the first question is the topic of another book. What would I propose to those working in the ministry in more challenging contexts? I have started some very initial research in looking at this. I've just come back from India, where I've been visiting a couple of projects that are designed to enhance teaching quality. And so all I can say now is just give you some initial thoughts. Very much, you know, I do not have as much experience in developing contexts probably as most people in this room. So all I can give you is based on what I know from top performing systems, what might work. And what I would propose, and this particularly relates to what Sonia was saying about the shortage of teachers, is I think that we need to differentiate between different types of teachers, rather than thinking of teaching as being you are a teacher and there's not a teacher, and those are the two dynamics or two positions. That instead, as some countries have done, we think about teacher career structures, where we might acknowledge that given how many millions of teachers we don't have yet, that it might be the case, it might continue to be the case that we have contract teachers who are secondary school leavers who are untrained, and then actually what they need is some really good resources, some really good lesson plans designed by more experienced teachers, rather than saying they're teachers or everyone has to be highly qualified and have a master's level degree. We just accept that actually in every school you should, depending on the size, have at least one highly qualified teacher, 2 qualified teachers, and 5 contract teachers who are being supported by those more senior teachers. So I suppose that's part of it, is not to think that you either have to upskill all at once all of the teachers, but to make sure that at least you've got a couple of people in each school who are highly qualified, who can support colleagues with lesson resources, and observe them and give them feedback on how to improve their teaching. So just one thought. And then the second thing I would say that seems to be working in many places around teacher motivation is making sure that there is space in the school week, or at least once a month, for teachers to meet together and talk about their teaching practice. Professional learning communities, either within the school or between schools, because that does seem to, in many different contexts, lead to increasing teacher motivation and just actually, it's worth me trying new things because I'm going to go and talk to my colleagues about it, and that's a good idea, and I'll try that, and actually I might see a change in my students. And many of the teachers that I spoke to in India in this trip recently were quite motivated by those meetings, and it's fairly cheap in terms of it as a school improvement methodology. So just a couple of ideas. How should we do this?
Yes.
Do you want to take each one as we go, or should I just
We can do that.
keep
Yes.
going?
Would you like to
Do you
add
wanna
on
take the
this?
first one?
I just,
Yes.
in terms of, I think if I understood the first question correctly, was how do we get the ministries to use data? I think that was your question for evidence. And so one of the biggest issues is there just isn't any data to begin with. So I think this is where we have to support countries with not just the resources, but to learn how to use data. And it also, I think, is a culture shift. And it's not something, if you're not used to it, if you don't understand how to work with the data, if you don't see how it links, how it helps you to clarify something, then it's a culture shift. It's a way of thinking that has to change within a group of people. And actually, you're a science teacher and a researcher, and I use statistics all the time, and I love it. It's very challenging. And once you start, working with data and see what it could show you, and I think everybody will be very interested in starting to play with it. So it's probably maybe a culture shift to me once we give everybody the opportunity to have some data, but right now there just isn't any. So that was my response to that first one.
And just in case, sorry if I misunderstood your question. I also want to add a kind of UK perspective on that, which is not only from UK, but also drawing on some work I've done in Brunei, is it's only useful to do data analysis and data-informed policy if the data is high quality to begin with. And if actually the data is being hurriedly collected or exaggerated or made up by tired teachers who've already been asked for this several times, then actually it doesn't matter what kind of analysis you do with it. If it's rubbish that's coming in, then there's no point in analysing it. So I think that's just, for me, something that I've seen being done badly in a number of places, is where they have attempted to use data, but actually it's not worth the paper it's written on in some cases. Social and emotional skills, huge topic.
Can I just say something on
Of
that?
course,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit on that, I would say there's a lot of assessment data that is available, and there is, of course, I think there is an issue with interpreting the data for policy purposes. I think that's what Mjoko was really referring to. And by the way, IEP is launching a new research. Uke is the guiding this research on the use of assessment data for planning purposes, preparing educational plans. So we will really analyze how such data is used actually when it comes to making decisions for the future for education systems. So I think we will have perhaps some insights to share in some years. Yeah. Would you like to say something? Hugo, no? Perhaps not. No, not now. Another time. Okay. Lucy, on the social
Just gonna, I mean, there are lots and lots of different elements to this question, so I'll just pick up on a couple. I think one really important element in terms of, who was it, you asked the question, yeah, but in terms of effective teaching and learning, is the relationship between the teacher and the students. Whichever country you go to, and research also, suggesting that having a good quality relationship where the student feels that the teacher cares about them and their progress has a huge impact on the student's motivation. So I think that's really important. In terms of the social and emotional well-being of the students in the countries that I went to, varied. And I don't think that there's a kind of, it's not quite the straightforward stereotype that in these top performing Asian systems, the children are all miserable but do really well. There's certainly a lot of pressure on them when it comes to the high stakes exams to get into high school in Japan and Shanghai, and in Singapore, because they select much earlier, that pressure is on them at age 12 as well. But I think that pressure is driven mainly by the assessment system and the high stakes nature of the assessment system, as opposed to anything else. I mean, I think the quality of the teaching, the amount of thought and time put into teacher training, the materials, the curriculum, the resources are all very well designed. I think a lot of that is, I expect, part of the cause of their success. And it's not, the success is not only driven by these high stakes assessments, which lead to student stress. So I suppose what I'm saying is that high student stress is not necessary for high performance, would be my hypothesis, but these things are impossible to prove. That makes sense? No.
microphone, please. Can I have a microphone? Yes. Yes, yeah, it's fine.
Maybe I was more curious about when you experience these teachers, how, for example, the ability is to inspire.
I think it's not working, huh?
Hello? Works now? Yes, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so your experience with the teachers, did you see it's not working again? We do it like this? Yes.
No, but it's not working with interpreters. We need a microphone. Huh?
Maybe
Can you come
this
here?
one?
Can you come here, please? Come to the microphone. No.
Very close interaction
Great.
here.
Yes.
Maybe that's it. Okay. So my question, in your experience with these teachers in Finland and Singapore, how much does it matter? Like, they can inspire, they can motivate, and can we put that in a textbook? Is that even possible, or is that just in the genes of these people? can this be taught? Thank you.
Okay.
So I think the first thing to say is that there is variety within every country. So within every country, you'll get some absolutely phenomenal, mind-blowing, passionate teachers, and you'll get some who you really would rather not end up in their class. But there are different proportions, I think. And I think that those different proportions, it's driven more by recruitment than teacher training. So in Finland and in Singapore, the examples that you asked about, it's very difficult to become a teacher. You have to really want to be a teacher in order to even get in. For teacher education in Helsinki, it's 10 people applying for every one teacher training place. And one of the things that they select for is evidence of passion for educating children. So you have already, through the selection process, managed to get some people who are more passionate. I think that does have a large part of it, and the teacher's personality and passion play a large role. But I also think that if you have well-designed lessons and really good resources, then even if you maybe not naturally the most inspiring person, you can still teach lessons that are interesting and effective. So I don't think that everyone has to be, what's the Robin Williams character where he stands on the desk? Anyone? Can't remember. But you haven't got to be one of these, the teachers that you'll always remember. What you need actually is a lot of consistently good teachers teaching consistently good lessons. Yes. Sorry,
Sonia,
dramatic.
would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, and I agree with what Lucy said, but actually, one of the reasons why high quality teacher training is important is because, and this is also based on research, which is that it does depend. I mean, there is personalities differ, but you could develop, not motivation, but because you can develop self-efficacy in the teacher through very high quality training. The self-efficacy then is linked to the teacher's motivation, and it's a cycle. So the more motivated you are, the more likely you want to perform, and the more you perform, the more you get practice, your self-efficacy builds, and it goes on into your motivation. So this is why it's also key to have a really high quality initial teacher education and professional development program, because the better trained you are, the more confident you are. And the more confident you are, and you can see you see the impact of your work on a child learning, that builds back, that feeds back into you, and that does help increase. That's that intrinsic motivation part that is really important. So there is a way to develop motivation. I don't know if develop is the right use, but there is a way to impact teachers' motivation through high quality teacher training.
So there seems to be something like a virtuous circle, so of developing, building our professionality in the teacher with providing initial teacher training. Then the matter may be how much of it and how much do you place actually in the continuous professional development. I think there are debates on that. So maybe that teacher training it could be an area, I think, where we have to have also we can make some policy suggestions.
Can I
Would you have?
add something as well, actually, just because I've just recently been there, based on what I was seeing in classrooms in India. And one of the projects I was looking at is one where they provide high quality lesson plans to the teachers to use. And the teachers I spoke to, you could see them becoming more confident because they were trying out these activities that they perhaps wouldn't have confidence to do without the amount of scaffolding they were being given. And they were seeing, as Sonia was saying, they were seeing the responses in the students, and they were gaining more confidence to do, the things which can't be in a lesson plan, the building on students' answers. You could see them getting more motivated, and part of the way that was done was through providing some scaffolding, as you do for students, providing some scaffolding for the teachers in terms of try this plan and now make it your own. So that's another approach. And then the final question in terms of the levels, I was focused on compulsory education. So I was in primary schools and lower secondary schools primarily. Brief visits to early year centres, but not much, mainly primary and lower secondary.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, great.
Good question over there.
Sorry? Yeah.
From our online audience?
Yes, perhaps we go for a second round on the audience, and then we go to the online audience. Sorry for the discrimination. Richard, would you like to start? Who else would like to? There is
Hello.
a second colleague there. I don't see the lady. And then on this side, you as well. So we have 3 more, and then we will go to the online audience. Huh?
Okay,
Richard,
thanks.
please.
Richard Stack. I'd like to get back. You came to the issue of teacher training and teacher recruitment. I'd like to get back to this. What did you learn in your investigations about how teachers are selected into the profession? What criteria are used in the different countries? If there are any generalizations you can make across these countries, and what is the mix of training that they undergo in teacher training? The mix in terms of between subject matter and more pedagogical self-efficacy learning, psychological, pedagogical related subjects. And do you have any observations as to how that plays itself out in the classroom and the attitudes of teachers, the different types of teacher training experiences, and finally, salaries and career structures?
We have a lot of stages.
It's a lot of questions.
Okay.
Could you please
So
raise
another
your
question
hands?
was the lady over there. Yes, who raises her arm.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm also an intern at IAP, and I wanted to ask about sort of inequality in education and the attainment gap. I think it's like one of the biggest challenges that a load of education systems face, particularly in the UK, but also elsewhere. So I wondered what sort of lessons that you learned and what lessons any of you have about how to reduce the attainment gap between the most economically disadvantaged students and their peers.
Okay. And you?
Thank you. My name is Lina Beltran. I work for UNICEF in Mozambique, one of the lowest performers in SACMEC. One of the challenges that we see, and you mentioned it at the beginning, Lucy, is the changes in policy, but with particular challenges in developing countries in 2 ways. The first one, once policy is developed, the time it takes from policy into full-fledged implementation at the field, it's incredibly long and tiresome. And the second one, which I think is quite particular in Mozambique, is the changing in policy, where you don't allow enough time to see if something has worked before you start testing something new. I have a colleague back home that very often says, whatever we get in the learning assessments right now, it's actually testing the policy of 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know how does that apply, particularly with PISA that happens with children at 15 years old? We'd say, what is Finland doing right now? Should we be asking what was Finland doing 10 years ago?
Absolutely, or 20 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
interesting question.
Okay. So fantastic questions, and I'll be completely honest, this is something which I'm looking at more now than I did when I did this initial research, because I was mainly in schools. I wasn't in teacher training institutions. So all I got was what I heard from teachers as opposed to interviewing anyone and focusing on teacher education specifically. So I'm going to give you a politician's answer, which is going to answer a question that's similar, but not exactly what you asked, if that's okay. In terms of different approaches to teacher attraction, selection and training, and how there are different ways of managing that. And I think there are different ways of doing it well. And Finland and Singapore take 2 quite different approaches, and it links into what you were saying about career structures too. So on the one hand, you've got Finland, where they've got into this virtuous cycle where because for various historical factors, teaching is respected. They've kept the pay. It's not high, but it's at a level of kind of comparable with other professions. It's seen as being quite a good lifestyle. It's respected because they've got 5 years teacher training, and there's therefore this virtuous loop. It's hard to get into, it's attractive, they do lots of training. Now, that's not very easy to do in most countries, partly because 5 years training is really expensive, partly because it's hard to get people to sign up. Particularly if it's not a high status profession, to get someone to sign up to 5 years of training is very difficult. So Singapore realized this, and Singapore used to have a shortage of teaching applicants. And what they did is a very, very clever, I think, approach, which is to say, rather than having to do all of teacher training in ITE initially when people first sign up, we'll give them some initial education. So that's 1 year postgraduate or 2 year diploma out of high school. But we'll see that as being just the beginning of their training. And then we'll structure the career so that they have to continue to be educated throughout their career in order to progress up the pay scale. So one thing that helps is that the government do pay for teacher training, which I know is not a possibility everywhere. But in Singapore, the first 3 years, your salary will increase as it does elsewhere. But if you want your salary to continue to increase beyond that, you've got to actually show that your knowledge and your skills have developed also. And there's training associated with achieving that a higher position. And that goes all the way up. So you might become a lead teacher, a master teacher, etc. And that way you've got that set up, so you've got more senior colleagues who are then having an influence in the training of less experienced colleagues. So I'm sorry that didn't answer your question. I want to answer your questions, but that's what I'm researching right now. So do you want to have a comment on that one before?
I agree. I mean, I really like the system in Singapore. It's a high quality system, the same with Finland. The thing about salary, again, I can say a few things, which off the top of my head, what I remember reading in other sources is that salary is a decent salary is important. And for developing countries, this is a problem because the resources are lacking. So we have to work towards that first, decent salary. But then it only works up to a certain point. If the profession is not valued and if the teachers aren't feeling if they don't have the autonomy and if they're not feeling respected, working conditions are poor, no matter how much you pay them, they are going to leave the profession. So a decent salary is there, but then there's something else to keep them in the profession, to keep those teachers that are intrinsically motivated in the profession. It's a combination of extrinsic motivators and intrinsic, and keeping them there is building the profession. It's building a profession that is going to be valued, that people are proud to be in.
Although I believe, I agree, but just to add to that teacher salary is one of the few things that correlates with PISA scores. So I think it has some, but partly in that it reflects how much a society values education and a whole lot of other things. On attainment gap, a few things, and I hope these aren't too obvious, but one of them is early intervention. So Finland has a whole load of professionals in or regularly visiting its primary schools. So they've got social workers, they've got psychologists, doctors and nurses. So they're identifying anything which is potentially going to stop a child from learning. Some of those aren't educational, some of those are social or physical, to deal with things early on. And then from an educational perspective as well, they identify if children are falling behind. As I said, they've got a standard for every year which children are expected to reach. If they're falling behind, that's identified. There's a special plan put into place by the class teacher initially, but if the class teacher can't handle that themselves, then by a special teacher who is an additional person in the school. Financial support, I think, makes a big difference. Obviously, Canada and America are different in many ways, but I think one of the major differences between their education systems is how schools are funded. Whereas, in America, schools are funded based on local housing tax. So the rich areas get more money for their schools, and it's not the case in Canada, where it's funded at the provincial level. So schools will have the same funding depending on the number of students. And what some countries will do is actually give more money to schools with greater need, and that's the ideal in terms of trying to narrow that attainment gap. I think there's also something to say about selection, but that's massive. I'm going to leave it. Sorry, it's too big. It's too big. Sonia, you can pick that up.
In terms of selection, it's very difficult. There's a minimum that you need to be selected, but then there's the development part of it. So maybe not everybody has equal talents, but it's, you mentioned in your book and with the children, talent shapes or people's abilities, competencies develop over time. So it is a difficult topic. I just wanted to clarify one point when we talked about salary before, which is true. Salary is very correlated with high achieving students. We did conduct some research with OECD data, PISA data, children who are 15, and myself and some colleagues. And what we did look at was to see in the PISA 2015 data set, children who are 15 were asked what profession they wanted to do, what career they wanted when they were about 15. And so some of them indicated teacher. And of those who had indicated teacher, we wanted to see if there was a relationship with salaries. And it turned out that indeed there's a relation. Children are more likely to say children at 15 are more likely to say that they would like to become a teacher if the salaries were higher. So there was a relationship in those countries where the salary is higher and this 15-year-olds saying they would want to be a teacher, but not for the highest performing group of kids. So the kids who were in the middle and in the low performance range would be interested in becoming a teacher if the salary was motivating enough. For the kids who scored higher on the PISA assessment, salary wasn't sufficient. So likely these kids know they have a bigger range of prospects when they graduate because they are the high achievers. And for them at that point, they probably know they have access to a higher salary already. They have their choice of occupations. So for these higher achieving kids, the salary didn't have an effect on their intention to want to be a teacher. So that's what I was trying to say before, how at a certain point, salary, we need a basic minimum wage. But if you want to get high achieving, talented high school kids to become teachers, which is what we want, you want the high quality individuals teaching other individuals to become also very high quality individuals. Salary wasn't enough.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
We've just got one more question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, yeah.
I completely agree, first of all, with your point about if you're looking at PISA results, shouldn't you be looking at what they were doing 10 or 15 years ago? Absolutely. And it really annoys me that so many people will go to Finland and say, look, Finland are now getting rid of subjects. Let's all get rid of subjects. Because that's not why they're performing well, because they've been performing well since 2000. And actually, their results have been going down since then. So actually, what they're doing now is probably not what we need to be looking at. Although I still think a lot of what they're doing is great. So yes, I think it's important. And certainly when I was there, partly the reason I included a lot of the historical context is because it's really important. So I was asking teachers, how is, particularly older teachers, how is what you're doing now different from what you were doing 10 years ago, 15 years ago when you first started teaching? So absolutely. And I do think it's a real challenge. And this partly links into what I was saying about use of data to inform policy earlier, is from what I've seen, and what I have seen is very limited compared to many of you. But data is not only used badly because the actual quality of the data is poor, but also because it's expected that there's such a quick turnaround. You've come in, implement this reform, we want to see the results going up next year, or actually in some cases in 3 months or 6 months. And that is not realistic if you think of particularly if it's a teacher training intervention, because it takes time for teachers to change their teaching. That obviously then takes time to affect the students' learning, which will then eventually show up in an assessment. And actually, as you say, that learning needs to be based on from the beginning and then building up concepts over years, not just what they did in year 10. So that is a challenge as well. And I think it's a political challenge because so often it's the education minister or someone else important in the department that wants this to be their reform and their stamp, and they want to see the results immediately. And I think it's the same when you have consultancies coming in to, they're being paid to do projects. The government wants to see results straight away. But unfortunately, education doesn't work like that. And you have to give it time. So that's not a solution. That's just an agreement. I feel your pain.
Thank you very much. We have some questions from our online audience. There's the first question. What has worked well to motivate teachers? That's a big one. and how to do this in a country with low salaries and limited resources. How can you
Same
motivate? Yes, I think it's in the related questions. And what can we do about large classroom sizes that hinder active and equal participation? Large class in many developing countries, you can have very large classes, sometimes up to 100 students. And what can you do? I think in terms of classroom organization, to make children participate more actively and more equally. Very practical question for a teacher.
Do you want to start?
Yes.
I'll leave the teacher question to you.
Okay.
What has worked well to motivate teachers? I mean, we've covered a bunch of things. You've covered things in your book, high quality teacher training. I do think that teaching, I mean, we've devalued teaching too much. So I think resources, we need the resources obviously to build, to develop the teacher training and to pay the teachers, but it does need to be a valued profession. And I think unfortunately the two are connected. And we're working very hard, at UNESCO, our colleagues here, and people like you to try to build the teaching profession for it to become a valued profession. And I say profession and people don't see it as a profession. And there are many reasons why people don't think of it as a profession, but it does, it's hard to get somebody, it would be hard to get someone to become a doctor if doctors were lowly paid and nobody trusted them. And, they're getting blamed for things that are beyond their control, right? So how to motivate teachers in countries with low resources, it's a tough question. I think we just have to keep at it, and we have to start with their training and showing the public that teachers do have an impact on the student learning outcomes, but they will only come about if we invest in high quality training.
I think so. Yes.
I agree. And I'd just add a couple of things, and apologies if I'm repeating myself because I've mentioned these two before, but I think two things which are reasonably cheap and quite effective at improving teacher motivation. One is providing them with some high quality resources to support what they're doing, not to dictate what they're doing, but that, it takes essentially, if lessons are planned centrally and they're good, it takes the cost of a piece of paper to give that to teachers. So partly is allowing them to see the success of a different approach to teaching that they can follow. Here's some suggestions for activities. Go outside and collect some seeds of different kinds of flowers, cut it in half, show the students, give them some ideas, and potentially that will give a bit of energy. And secondly, as I said before, giving time for teachers to meet together and talk about what's working for them and what isn't, so that they have those professional relationships and talk about what they're doing and they're not isolated in their own classrooms. And thirdly, recognition, because many teachers I talk to, they don't want recognition financially necessarily. It's just someone saying, well done, we know that you work hard. So recognition from middle leaders, from central office, and trying to stop this constant blaming of teachers. Often when a reform doesn't work, it's, the teachers need more training, as opposed to actually what you trained them in was rubbish or you didn't train them properly. It's always the teacher's fault, which I think is damaging. Yes. Large class sizes. So I think it's, first of all, acknowledgement that it's not easy. Secondly, an acknowledgement that I haven't done it, but I have been asked a question, so I'll try and answer it. I think there's a lot you can do. As I said, a lot of the teaching that I observed in these top performing countries, it was whole class interactive teaching. So it was reasonably structured and teacher directed rather than being student led, where students were doing their own thing, choosing their own thing, or running projects. And I think with whole class interactive teaching, you could do that with a big group. So first of all, if you're clear with your modeling, you're asking open questions, and admittedly not all students can answer to you, but what you can do is, right, here's a question I want you to discuss. What are the different ways you could do this? Talk to your partner about it. Think, pair, share is one idea that can work, where you still got all the students talking and thinking if to each other. And then also short, sharp group work. If you have that many children and you try and do group work, which is lasting the whole lesson, the children will probably go off topic and will need help and won't get it. But if you give, clear, so this is what we're working on, here's some modeling, now here's 5 minutes to try your own version or write your own story or come up with a different way of doing this, and then feedback from some of them. I think there's some ways in which you can get children being a bit more active within a very large classroom without them going completely off the rails. But as I said, it's hard and I haven't done it. It's just an idea.
Very interesting, huh? There was another question about early childhood education. How can developing countries strengthen their early childhood education? It's a little bit a broader question,
Yes.
but since this is one of your recommendations from your book for high-performing systems, perhaps you have some ideas for developing countries.
Okay. So, it's tricky because I think it costs money. And I'm not an expert in child development, but many of the teachers who work in earlier settings in these countries are. They will have training, they will be qualified, and you'll have qualified staff teaching in earlier settings. I think that's partly it, and that's not an easy solution, of course, because of the training involved. I suppose part of the point that I was making in that, one of the principles, for those of you who haven't read my book, is getting children ready through high quality preschool rather than starting children too young. So I suppose it's partly what I'm saying is, don't think that the way to get children to have higher literacy and numeracy is to start trying to get them to read and write at age 4 if they're not ready for that. And I think that's a trap that we've fallen into in the UK, and something which isn't supported by the data. Of course, some children are ready, and that, in which case, absolutely go for it. It's not that children should be stopped from learning those things if they're ready for it and they want to do it, but just that there are lots of skills that children need to develop before they're able to do that. So fine motor skills, for example. So I suppose in terms of, it's a really hard question, but advice for lower resource contexts would be to get some early year specialists into central government, get them to design activities for children which can be set up in low resource contexts. So for example, different coloured beans, and then activity, children having to sort beans, or a little game that the teacher can play with them where there's a bunny in the middle and the bunny lays some eggs and the children have to count how many, just some ideas, some simple activities that are going to help children to access the kind of early literacy and numeracy knowledge that they need to then access school, that anyone can deliver without having to be an early years expert. But again, really hard question.
Would you like to say something, Sonia?
I agree. It's the early learning doesn't have to be in a school, like you said, as long as it's high quality. But the trained teacher who
It
can
helps.
provide the high quality play, learning through play is the key. And I agree.
Okay. Do we have any final burning question still? Oh, there is one. Yes. So you have the final burning question. Yes. So colleague from UNESCO. Yeah.
Just about the well-resourced guided textbooks from Finland. I'm just wondering who develops these textbooks and whether they're available outside the country and outside the teaching course.
That's very straightforward one.
From what I've been told, it's expert teachers who will develop them. So I think those textbooks are developed some at a national level and some at a municipal level. And I don't know how they select them, but it's experienced teachers who feed into the design of those. So that's the textbooks. I mean, you haven't asked about curricula, but I'm going to say something about it. The national curriculum in Finland there is a central curriculum, but it's pretty high level. And then at each level, as you go down to the municipality level, they add a bit more detail. And then at the school level, they add a bit more detail. So again, you've got some experienced teachers adapting the curriculum as well, which is then taught by all teachers, the more and the less experienced teachers. I don't know if they're available. I mean, I imagine they would be, but they are in Finnish. So that possibly might be the limitation for many people. Yeah. Singapore, on the other hand, so sorry, but Singapore, the teacher guides, Singapore teaches in English. So I think they are available, and certainly some of their textbooks that are very good are available. So maths, no problem, for example, is one of the Singaporean textbooks being used in the UK to great effect already.
So perhaps a role for international organizations to make available extremely good teaching guides, teacher guides, or teaching materials. I mean, it's just an idea. Thank you to both of you very much for all these ideas that you have provided us with in your presentations and in the answers to these very interesting questions. Thank you all. Thank you, the audience, also for these very interesting questions and leading to a very very many insights in your responses. I think what I take from this discussion are 3 points. Which we haven't discussed so much, but which are a little bit implicit. I think one first point is it's very important to be concerned with education systems and making everybody succeed in education systems. So we have seen the high-performing countries are those countries that make everyone, close to everyone, succeed. And they do it with, the teachers do it with a lot of dedication, and they have kind of interiorize that this is their job. It's not to sort students into the good and the bad ones, but it's really to make everyone succeed. I think that's a very important lesson, implicit lesson we have from both of your presentations. The other one is that teaching methods are very important. You talked about the cognate activation, if I remember it right, the cognitive activation. So if teaching methods are important, then teacher training is also important. And that feeds very much into what Sonia, you have, with some of the ideas that you have provided us with. And perhaps we have to think about, balances in teacher education to be thought of between initial teacher education and continuous professional development and coaching while the teachers are on the job. So there are different types of instruments that can feed together and that have to thought through together to make a coherent system. So that's my second thought. And I think the third one, you have emphasized both very much, support to teachers in terms of teaching materials, teacher guides matters a lot. Yes. So we have a lot of things to do to support our teachers and to provide them with the best environment to be as effective as they can in a particular context. So again, thank you to both of you. We have now a cocktail, so you can continue the discussion with our two speakers and among yourselves. So on you move one stair up, and then you will find the cocktail, and we are all looking forward to meeting you there. So see you at the cocktail. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. Some really hard questions.
Yes.